but thank you all for being here. It's great to see people who haven't been here in a minute, some people who haven't been here at all. This is really exciting to have some growth in the room. As the weather got better, there was a rapid decline in the people that were showing up in person and online, I'll be real. But yeah, cool. Awesome. Welcome to week 7 of our 12-week study of Black Reconstruction, where we'll be talking about the 7th chapter, looking forward. And I'll explain a bit at the end. We're at the point in Black Reconstruction where we're definitely going to be accelerating a little bit. We're going to be moving more quickly through the material. And one of the guidelines for reading Du Bois that I mentioned at the beginning of the seminar will become very important, which is the skill that you all will need to develop to move through historical material relatively quickly and get to the point, right? It's not always easy. Some guidelines in Du Bois are when he starts to speak in a very poetic way, you should definitely be paying attention. And also he'll use, particularly in these chapters and the state-by-state Reconstruction experience chapters, he will use extensive quotes. He'll be quoting for 3 or 4 pages at a time. I'm not saying skip it all, but you need to sort of move through it quickly for next week and get to the point. And there will also be a lot of repetition when it comes to those weeks. So I'll give you more forewarning on that as we move into it. As it stands, though, we're here to look at one chapter this week, chapter 7. This is looking forward. Last week we talked about looking backward. And for Du Bois, this is a pair of chapters that work in conjunction with each other. We're talking about the moment in the period directly after the Civil War. In other words, and for people that maybe are less familiar with the material, the Confederacy surrenders. Within days, Lincoln is assassinated. Within days, in other words, Johnson is president, who is a very ambivalent, supporter of abolition, if that, and someone who next week we'll talk about the deep, deep dislike, we'll call it, / absolute contempt that Du Bois has for Andrew Johnson as the representative not only of a sort of racist white border state moderate, but of someone who comes from poor white background, right? So the next chapter is called The Transubstantiation of a Poor White, how Andrew Johnson betrays in a certain way his origins and becomes an enemy of Reconstruction. But these chapters are dealing with the period in which Johnson has just come to power, in which the question is posed about what to do in the immediate aftermath of the war. Again, this is a context of economic devastation, the total destruction of the Southern economy, and it's a context in which very little has otherwise changed. We've talked about the ways in which we think about abolition and we think about the end of the Civil War as this very sudden phenomenon, but it's a very uneven one, and it's one that's much more gradual than we might assume, by which I mean the fact that many people were not aware that abolition had happened. Many people were not aware that the war had come to an end and that the Confederacy had been defeated. This is, possibly the case with someone like John Wilkes Booth, who doesn't really fully think that the war is over, possibly when he kills Lincoln, right? There's this last attempt to save the Confederacy. But it's also uneven in the sense that even those, formerly enslaved people who had been freed or had been informed of their freedom, many were not informed by their former owners, many who had been informed confronted the question of, well, what do I do now? Like, do I just leave and go somewhere else? Well, how am I going to survive? What kind of work will I do? What kind of a job is open to me? And also the question on the part of the planters of how do I maintain control of this labor force, right? That's the absolute imperative. And again, this leads us to these bigger questions that Du Bois is constantly posing, namely the fact that white supremacy is a huge and essential part of this story, but the fundamental motivation from the very beginning is, how do I make these people work? Or how do I make any people work in the cheapest and easiest way? And white supremacy ends up being the most powerful mechanism for doing that. So we talked last week about the different ways in which, in that moment after the end of the Civil War, various sectors were looking backward. In other words, looking at these sort of previously existing or retrograde or backwards approaches to dealing with these questions. The 2 main ones were, first and foremost, the idea of dealing with the problem of Black Americans, the problem of formerly enslaved people. Again, Du Bois very famously in Souls of Black Folk writes, what does it mean to be a problem? And here we see the question of the problem emerging again. But the question of dealing with that problem through deportation and colonization was a main strategy, particularly of many liberal Americans, namely those who said, well, listen, we don't support slavery maybe, but nevertheless, Black people and white people will never be able to coexist in this country. Therefore, the best thing we can do is either in a charitable way, encourage them to relocate themselves to Liberia or somewhere else, or in a less charitable way, ship them all off to an island in the Caribbean or a carved out zone in a Latin American country. This was Lincoln's strategy, right? Until very close to the end, right? And we documented a little bit last week his shift in the contradictory ways that, in a certain sense, he's still asking about deportation. He's asking the Secretary of the Navy, can we accomplish this? In part because he knows that the South is so racist, and that he has organized and he has armed these Black soldiers, and the South will never accept that. So there's a very contradictory way in which, even as Lincoln himself is becoming more sort of a stauncher supporter of abolition, which happens only over time, he's still thinking about deportation to deal with the contradictions that this raises, right? The second strategy of looking backwards is that which reflected the worldview of the planter class itself, or the remnants of that planter class. There's this way that Du Bois talks about the planter class being disintegrated and destroyed, but there's clearly planters returning to the land. There are new planters arriving and trying to sort of control and buy that land and put it to work. And so the fundamental worldview and economic orientation of that class for Du Bois is to impose a permanent racial caste system, right? A permanent mode of enforcing labor, productivity through racial categories by new means, right? This is not, strictly speaking, the return to slavery, right? But it is, how can we maintain a racial caste system without slavery, right? What other means can we use? And the means that most directly express this were what were called the Black Codes, many of which were directly copied from the slave codes, with changing the word slave changed to the word Black, and they governed many aspects of so-called free people's behavior. Specifically, we emphasize the role of vagrancy, which means you can't be without a job, without a home, or moving around freely, or you can be arrested, imprisoned, and enslaved again, right? And equally powerful was were the Black Codes around apprenticeship, meaning that your children were required to engage in a labor apprenticeship program, and the former owner of you or those children had the right of first refusal. In other words, they had to be apprenticed to your former owner, right? It doesn't take much to see the ways in which those laws are direct continuations of the slave system and attempts to extract that labor through precisely the same means, right? Attempts to adapt in the, how would you describe it, the sort of thinnest of way to the condition of emancipation, right? Very little is changing, and the system is being reproduced. We also, however, saw the fact that, maybe, and I think this is an overlooked piece of that chapter on looking backward, that the planter's desire, which is permanent racialized labor system, directly contradicts the desire and demand of poor whites in the South, which is ultimately to become rich, to become a planter, but in the meantime to displace Black labor. So you've got the planters wanting Black labor, and you've got white Southerners wanting to be the white labor, right? This is a contradiction, and a fundamental one that's going to become incredibly crucial as we move into the next chapter. That was looking backwards. Now we're looking forward, and we're looking toward the question of two different outlooks that emerge for transforming the world.
How do you talk about the West, like the Western, like the folks who, like the immigrants, folks that are coming for the westward expansion, over stuff like that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they're also ambivalent toward.
Yeah. That's a good. So we got a question about the West. And sorry, I'm just repeating it because we're on the live stream as well, so we want to make sure that folks can hear. We'll also take questions kind of in the middle, and we'll take some more questions at the end. But it's a huge contradiction, right? And one of the main contradictions that we talked about with regard to the West is that there's a struggle on the the part of the planters who want to maintain this racialized labor system, and they want it to be politically dominant across the country. In other words, in the House of Representatives, their way of doing that and their way of producing more profit is to expand westward. However, that's being blocked. So they're struggling to maintain their profits. They're struggling to build a dominant power block, but they're being prevented from doing so by so-called free soilers who don't want slavery moving west of the Mississippi. But we talked about the contradiction around why, right? Which is some people are opposed to slavery on principle, and some people are opposed because they don't want Black people in the West, right? Both of these are working together to try to push back on the expansion of the slave system for very different and contradictory reasons, right? And that leads to a situation that propels the South toward war because the planters don't have any other way out, right? The other piece that's worth mentioning, and it comes up a bit in this chapter as well, is this question of who is in the West and what motivates them, right? Not only who's migrating out there, what kind of white laborers are moving west, but also the way that access to land transforms people's consciousness in ways that are, again, in tension with abolition, but also at moments allied with it. So we'll say definitely a couple of things about that as well. In this session, we're talking about two visions for looking forward, right? Two different ways, two clashing and blending theories of what the future of American society should look like in the aftermath, which again, we're not looking backward toward these sort of what Du Bois saw as impossible resolutions of the question of slavery in the presence of formerly enslaved people, but looked forward to a transformation, to a radical rebuilding of American society. But that is not a good thing for Du Bois, right? Because as we'll see, the two visions that clashed and blended were on the one hand, abolition democracy, and on the other hand, capitalist autocracy, right? The absolutely unhindered dominance of this new industrial capitalist system. So he's saying we're looking forward. That is not necessarily toward a utopian society. It's toward, in many ways, the dystopian dominance of unbridled capitalist greed. And that's, spoiler alert, that's where we are, right? Like that's what Du Bois sees in the failure of Reconstruction, is that we are fully subjected to that. And part of the story he's telling us is precisely how we got here. But we want to begin with the way that he describes, and we often begin with these chapter summaries. I believe last week was a very long chapter summary. This one is last week was a short one. This one is a long one. But they're always very, very powerfully revealing of what it is that Du Bois is trying to do in the chapter. So if you look at the top of 182 in the summary, he says, how two theories of the future of America clashed and blended just after the Civil War. Clashed and blended. The one was abolition democracy based on freedom, intelligence, and power for all men. The other was industry for private profit directed by an autocracy determined at any price to amass wealth and power. The uncomprehending resistance of the South and the pressure of Black folk made these two thoughts uneasy and temporary allies. In every chapter and in every chapter summary, as a result, Du Bois is telling a very dynamic story. Nothing is a description, everything is a dynamic, right? So he's saying these are contradictory ways of looking at the world. However, there's a dynamic that brings them together. Again, spoiler alert, that bringing together is the foundation of what makes Reconstruction possible and dooms it at the same time. And we'll begin to unfold that over this chapter and the others. The other thing that's worth mentioning is when he says the resistance of the South made these two allies. That's a very interesting dynamic. It's a crucial one throughout this story, and it's one that in a more general way is often referred to as the whip of the counter-revolution, right? When your enemies are so intransigent and so unable, in this case, as Du Bois views them, unable to change, unable to reform themselves, that leads to a radicalization. And again, that radicalization in this case is the dictatorship of Reconstruction. At one point in the chapter, he says the South was so intransigent, so stubborn, that they got the Freedmen's Bureau as their just reward. In other words, they could not be changed, therefore they had to be obliterated. They had to be absolutely confronted by force, with this power of the dictatorship. He begins, a printer and a carpenter, a rail splitter and a tailor, Garrison, Christ, Lincoln, and Johnson were the tools of the greatest moral awakening America ever knew, chosen to challenge capital invested in the bodies of men and annul the private property, the private profit of slavery. Just incredible, right? A printer, a carpenter, a rail splitter, and a tailor. Again, these are not heroes, all in the story. So you've got these two visions: abolition democracy on the one hand, and industrial autocracy on the other. They're confronting each other, looking forward. The first thing to say is that abolition democracy, which many of you may recognize as something that Angela Davis writes about today, Robin Kelley, Ruthie Wilson Gilmore speak of, is an incredibly crucial concept for contemporary abolitionists. It's also a concept that's very hard to pin down. And in Du Bois, we're going to get a sort of fleshed out version of what it means and what it could mean through the course of Reconstruction. But even when he begins with it here, it is a little amorphous, right? Sometimes he uses it, as in the beginning of this chapter, to simply describe the movement for abolition in relation to democracy, or to simply describe those sectors that come together and struggle for abolition. But it's going to gain sort of more force, and it begins to gain that really from the very, very beginning. He refers to abolition democracy as the prolongation of Puritan idealism transformed by the frontier into a theory of universal democracy. And we're going to work through a bit of the tensions that are involved in that. But the first thing to understand and then to notice in the description and in the chapter summary is that he describes these as both entirely different ways of looking at the world, on the one hand, and then he describes them as often confused with one another. He even describes them as mingled with one another. Why are they often confused if they're entirely different? Well, he says, because they are confused in so many individual minds. How could abolition democracy on the one hand and unbridled capitalism be confused in anyone's mind, right? And yet he's saying this is a very, very common confusion. First, again, we go back to the description of what he described, of what he called abolition democracy as an extension of Puritan idealism transformed by the frontier. What could that possibly mean? And why would abolition itself be infused by a kind of frontier ideology? It's because of land, right? It's because of access to land. It's because the availability of land created something like opportunity for those who could access it, right? So there's this blending of the frontier, which again, we should understand as settler colonialism, with this universal democracy that is abolition democracy. First step. Second, and very much connected to that, is the ways in which that means abolition democracy is susceptible to what we've already named as the American assumption. This is what he goes into at the beginning, the bottom of 182. Behind, and now he's talking about capitalism, behind this extraordinary industrial development as justification in the minds of men lay what we might call the great American assumption, which up to the time of the Civil War was held more or less explicitly by practically all Americans. He's saying everyone believes this. The American assumption was that wealth is mainly the result of its owner's effort, and that any average worker can by thrift become a capitalist. This is bootstraps theory, right? This is radical individualist. You work hard enough, you can become rich, you can move up, you can elevate your class position. We're very familiar with this idea, I think. And Du Bois says something very funny about, first of all, he's saying everyone believes that, which is kind of incredible, but then again, very familiar to us. But he immediately says, the curious thing about the assumption was that while it was not true, it was very funny, right? He says, everyone believes this, not true. While it was not true, this is where it gets really interesting. It was undoubtedly more nearly true in America from 1820 to 1860 than in any other contemporary land. He said, it's not true that anyone can raise themselves up by their bootstraps, but it was closer to true at this moment in this place than anywhere else. Why? Again, land, right? Land, access to land, the ability to move west, the ability to escape from industrial enslavement and, seize some land, use it as a basis for either producing what you need or investing in the future. Again, grounded in settler colonialism, but very real for Du Bois is the need to understand that this is real opportunity for many people, right? And this real material basis for opportunity creates a situation in which everyone believes this to be true, even when it's not. Is it contradictory? Yes. He says its most sinister contradiction is that it coincides and was contemporary, as he puts it, this is the middle of 183, it was contemporary with the Cotton Kingdom. Its most sinister contradiction was that it, of course, this opportunity coincided with the height of American slavery, right? The ways in which the profits derived from cotton made slavery absolutely essential and central. Of course, though, this was not its only sinister contradiction. The other sinister contradiction was that it was premised upon access to indigenous land, right? So Du Bois is doing something very interesting without saying it, because this is a book that you could definitely read as not registering settler colonialism sufficiently, not registering the history of indigenous displacement and genocide. But here he's building it right into the argument as well, right? Without naming it as such, and without even subjecting it maybe to the critical scrutiny that he could, without saying that it's absolutely inhuman and barbaric what's being done, he is nevertheless showing that the entirety of the American assumption, in other words, bootstraps theory, is grounded in settler colonialism, which is true, right? If we want to think about why it is that the United States, more than any other country, is so radically capitalist and believes that individuals can raise themselves up economically against all evidence to the contrary, it's settler colonialism that underpins that, right? Again, the mechanism, the material mechanism being the ability to move, to seize access to land, the fact that that continues, that process continues right up to and continues after the Civil War, right? The expansive nature of manifest destiny and the availability of land, right? So in other words, these two contrasting and contradictory visions were not confused in minds alone. It was not just ideological. There were multiple things going on. First, they were internally contradictory in ways that put them into relation with one another. And second, they were dialectically bound to each other through Reconstruction. Again, this is part of the story we're going to tell. By which, when I say dialectically bound to each other in that context, all I mean is that they became, by the force of circumstance, allied to each other for a moment that, again, Du Bois refers to as an eternal second in a cycle of 1,000 years. These two opposing forces become allies. Capitalism supports Reconstruction, supports black votes, supports the breaking of the slave-owning class, right? Not what would necessarily be expected given the centrality of slavery to US capitalism up to that point. And again, this is what makes Reconstruction possible, and it's what dooms Reconstruction to collapse. So both of these approaches are internally contradictory. What are the internal contradictions of abolition democracy? First and foremost, and he's mentioned this before, he's hinted at it, but he makes it very clear here, that abolition democracy believes in the American assumption, right? At a certain point in a previous chapter, he said abolition represented capital, right? It represented a modernizing force to free labor. It was grounded in a kind of moralism that was opposed to slavery, but that didn't go so far as being opposed to exploitation or to even understanding exploitation, right? The idea was that freedom meant then freedom to participate in a capitalist system. But for Du Bois, there's an inherent tension here, and not even, again, not on the realm of thought, but on the realm of how does this question of equality and universal democracy that abolition democracy poses, how does it play out in practice? And here he does this very interesting thing, which others have already noted, which is that he copies and pastes an entire chapter from the introduction into the middle of page 184, where he says the true significance of slavery in the United States to the whole social development of America lay in the ultimate relation of slaves to democracy. The ultimate relation of slaves to democracy. Again, this is not a moral statement. This is not an ethical statement. This is a statement of literally what does it mean, right? Because what he goes on to say, and again, we talked about this in the introduction, what he goes on to say is that if you give everyone the vote, how do you prevent them from voting against their own exploitation? If you give them all the vote, How do you prevent them from resisting capitalism with that vote, right? If all labor, black as well as white, became free, were given schools and the right to vote, what control could or should be set to the power and action of these laborers? How would property and privilege be protected? In other words, Du Bois from the very beginning understands the fact that universal democracy cannot be kept separate from material realities, right? Cannot be kept separate from what he understands later to be the dictatorship of labor, right? So the tension is that abolition democracy espouses a kind of American assumption, exceptionalism of bootstraps theory, but that's not how it plays out in practice. That you can't just give people the vote and expect that it has no consequences for capital, right? The flip side of that is, as he puts it, and this is on 185, freedom, in order to be free, required a minimum of capital, right? Meaning that emancipation is meaningless without some economic redistribution as well. So here again, the political and the economic are not separable. And so again, through a dynamic process that for Du Bois is built into this idea of universal democracy, abolition democracy becomes something more than it was. It's pushed, as he puts it, toward the conception, this is the top of 185. Thus, abolition democracy was pushed toward the conception of a dictatorship of labor. Although few of its advocates wholly grasped the fact that this necessarily involved a dictatorship by labor over capital and industry. So something is happening that's not being understood, that's not being recognized, which is that people will use their votes to fight for equality, economic equality. And that when they do that, something very, very different is happening from simple political equality. Those are the internal tensions of abolition democracy. What are the internal tensions of capitalist autocracy? That it wants, as Du Bois puts it, a more intelligent exploitation of labor. As he had pointed out, the planter could have reformed in theory, could have modernized, could have embraced free labor, could have used that to maintain its own capacity to exploit labor, but could not grasp that, right, as a framework. The planters were not the right people to make that transition, right? And so here is capital, northern capital, wanting to modernize, wanting to figure out a new system for the exploitation of labor, but what it wants is simply exploitation, right? And this creates a temporary alliance in which northern capitalists need black votes in the South. They need black votes to overthrow the planter class. They need black votes to push through Reconstruction. And ultimately, by doing that, they empower, again, black workers who will challenge their own exploitation, who will resist capital, and things begin to go too far, right? This is part of the story. And this is part of the internal tensions, that they need those votes, they employ those votes. There's going to be an interesting conversation in this chapter about the fact that Du Bois implies that capitalists want black votes more than abolitionists want black votes, right? And so we're going to disentangle why that is. How does this play out immediately after the war? This is Andrew Johnson's interregnum, right? Where he has come suddenly to power. He didn't expect to be in power. Again, he's a very, very moderate, this is a coalition ticket when Lincoln is reelected. Johnson's not a radical person. He is someone who is a populist, who hates the rich because he comes from poverty, but is not particularly a friend of enslaved people, not a particular enemy of slavery, but allies with abolitionists to overthrow slavery and support that, that piece. But he's suddenly cast into office. He's also absolutely a drunk and, unprepared to do this, unprepared to, and if you look at like historical representations of Johnson in media and in film, it's very funny. And Du Bois, again, we'll talk a great deal about that. Johnson is thrown into power, and the question, again, is very much up in the air. We knew what Lincoln wanted to do. There was the beginning of a Reconstruction plan, but it hadn't been implemented yet. And so when I say Johnson's interregnum, we're talking about the ways in which everything is kind of sort of scrambling for a series of months and years. The planters are trying to reassert control. Capitalists are trying to jockey for control. Capitalists are going south, trying to buy up land, put it to work. There's all of this happening at once, and it's not clear what Reconstruction is going to mean yet, right? Capital shifts during this period. In the beginning, of course, capital was allied with the Southern planters in the sense that it bought cotton. It was opposed in the sense that it wanted full representation for the North and sort of the dominance of the North. But immediately after the war, capitalists in the North are not very hostile to Southern planters. What happens, and this is where the whip of the counter-revolution kicks in, is that the Southern planters are so intransigent, they're so stubborn, they're so racist, they're so unable to see anything but the total reconstitution of something that looks just like slavery, that capital is scared off. That's what Du Bois says at the bottom of 185. In the face of such intransigence, Northern industry was willing to yield. But further on, as time went on, Northern industry was frightened and began to move toward the stand which abolition democracy had already taken, namely temporary dictatorship. Endowed Negro education, legal civil rights, and eventually even votes. So the intransigence of the Southern planters scares off capitalists. Capitalists move toward the camp of abolitionists. All of a sudden, abolitionists who were treated as fanatics before and during the war, who were seen as a tiny minority, suddenly they are expected to play a key role in figuring out what this process would look like. Abolition democracy accepts this alliance, accepts this deal with capitalists, this sort of poisoned deal, and it's on page 186, for a series of reasons. One, because as Du Bois puts it, they had an exaggerated faith in democracy. This is about 2/3 of the way down. Their theory of democracy led them to risk it all, even in the absence of that economic and educational minimum, which they knew was next to indispensable. Abolitionists were not saying just the right to vote and then we're good, right? They were saying we need education, we need economic redistribution. But they had faith in democracy as being able to correct that and set it on the right path. Again, that's something we'll see play out in this chapter. Secondly, he says they accepted the alliance with capital because of the unconscious remnants of the American assumption that they carried with them in their own contradictory approach. And third, and maybe most important, they accepted because, as Du Bois puts it, they could not refuse, right? This is a fundamental piece that has really major implications for how we interpret all of Reconstruction, right? Which is the fact that capital is in the driver's seat kind of the whole time, right? It is pulled into alliance, it's forced to move this way or that by grassroots action, by the possible and the power and the potentiality that Black workers hold in particular. But it's possible to read this whole history to see it as sort of something that's fully in control of capital. This compromise between capital and abolition democracy, again, these two different ways of looking forward that come together, is going to be super important, right? What was a temporary dictatorship of labor, under Reconstruction, during the process, right? Capital upholding Reconstruction, supporting the dictatorship, supporting the right to vote, then is withdrawn at the end of Reconstruction. So this is the arc of the full decade. And here Du Bois, again, in his very characteristically devastating prose. This is about 1/3 of the way down on 187. This is the downfall of Reconstruction, 1873 to 1876. He says capital began in 1876, an exploitation which was built on much the same sort of slavery which it had helped to overthrow in 1863. It murdered democracy in the United States so completely that the world does not recognize its corpse. It established as dominant in industry a monarchical system which killed the idea of democracy. Again, democracy is the question, right, in a lot of ways. Not only democracy in the sense of abolition democracy and what it could mean and what it could set into motion, but the victory of capital that brings down Reconstruction is a murder of democracy, right? And again, Du Bois writing in 1935, does not believe that the US is anywhere near as democratic as it was in the 1870s. And we could say, again, very likely today, that it still hasn't returned to that level of democracy. The possibility of democracy that existed in the 1870s was murdered and was replaced by the rule of capital. Now, and again, as I sort of foregrounded, Du Bois says something very peculiar about the role of democracy in the vote in this alliance between abolition and democracy on the one hand and capital on the other. This is right in the middle of 187. He says, votes for Negroes were in truth a final compromise between business and abolition. That makes sense, right? Votes being a compromise between business and abolition. We think we know how that sentence is going to end. It actually ends in the opposite way. In other words, those votes, as he puts it, were forced on abolition by business as the only method of realizing the basic principles of abolition democracy. Again, this is very strange. He's saying that capitalists were the ones that wanted black votes. Abolitionists were like, wait a second, let's think about this. Let's think about it differently. And we want to, I think, disentangle why. So to start with, Du Bois talks about the so-called, what he calls the legalistic formula for thinking about this moment and this interregnum. He says that, the idea that formerly enslaved people were suddenly free, as he puts it, did not cling to the facts, right? This was not a sudden freedom. This was not a sudden transformation. This was, what did Fanon describe it as? At one point in Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon says it's a shift from one way of life to another and not from one life to another, right? There are things changing, but they're far from the radical transformation that we're often told. Again, many people are on the same plantation, working for the same people, under the same conditions. So there's, in some ways, very little that has changed. This is now on 189. Yet after the war, they were still not free. They were still practically slaves. And how was their freedom to be made a fact? This is the key question, right? How was their freedom to be made a fact? It seems very simple, but it's not, right? Because in theory, the fact is that people are free, but he's saying the fact is not that they are free. They are free on paper, they are not free in fact. How does the freedom become a fact? It could be done in only one way. They must have the protection of law, and back of law, this is where it gets interesting, must stand physical force. They must have land, they must have education. How is all of this to be done? And you're like, wait, what the fuck? You just said it could be done in one way, and then you listed off 6 different complex pieces that are required for that one way to be true, and none of them says anything about votes, right? Protected by law could imply and should imply votes, but he says something very clear and very interesting, which is they must have not only land and education, which are always crucial for Du Bois, but physical force. The question of what physical force exists to uphold Reconstruction is going to be a really foundational one. And when he says, how was this all to be done? It just sounds like Lenin, right? It's like, what is to be done? How is this to be done? What are the steps that need to be taken? And I think you've got like sort of powerful echoes here that lead us to the question of, again, a Leninist question of dictatorship, right? He's not talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat. However, he will bring it up in chapter 10, as we're going to see. So abolitionists were suddenly not fanatics. They were suddenly at the heart of these debates and these discussions. And Du Bois crystallizes and seeks to sort of represent different branches and different pieces of what abolition offers through 2 key figures that, if you got to read through the chapter, you will have noticed. And these are the figures of Charles Sumner in the Senate on the one hand, and Thaddeus Stevens in the House. They're the 2 leaders of kind of the abolitionist bloc, and those who are making the arguments for Reconstruction laws, for abolition, for the different amendments. Sumner, you've already heard about, who's really the key figure in driving forward emancipation. And Stevens is going to be, again, standing in and alongside Sumner in the House. Again, it's interesting that Du Bois is crystallizing abolition through figures who are congressional figures, right? It's partly because of the story he's trying to tell. That's a story that has everything to do with the Reconstruction laws, with the process as it happens at the heights of power. We want to be always aware, though, of the ways in which, Sumner and Stevens are not the entirety of the abolitionist universe, certainly, right? And so we always want to, I think, make sure that we're thinking about and remembering that piece. But just very roughly speaking, the reason he's having these two figures stand in for branches of the abolitionist movement is because they, that Sumner argues very clearly for political rights, meaning the vote, as the key mechanism, and Stevens argues very clearly for land and land redistribution as really crucial for what abolition should mean. For Sumner, the vote is both a weapon and a schoolhouse, right? If we're talking a lot about education, and we'll come back to this question, how do you learn? How do you learn to be a citizen? Well, you learn by voting, right? You learn in the process of voting. It's a schoolhouse, it's a weapon to use against your enemies. That's a crucial piece. Others, however, will see education as prior to the vote, right? Well, you don't vote until you understand and are educated enough to engage in democracy. Sumner's making an argument for the contrary. Stevens understood that the entire social and economic structure of the South had to be dismantled and rebuilt, right? He argued specifically for breaking up large plantations. He argued for redistributing those lands to freedmen as the basis for a totally different kind of society. On the bottom of 198, he says, "From the beginning, I've regarded confiscation only as ancillary to emancipation. The great plantations, which have been so many nurseries of the rebellion, must be broken up, and the freedman must have its pieces." Right? He's making an economic argument for the dismantling of this economic structure as a fundamental precondition for making, again, as Du Bois puts it, making emancipation real, giving it teeth, making it something that's lasting, right? The reality, though, is that the maturation of abolition democracy, right, the overcoming of the contradictions that we mentioned at the beginning, specifically the contradiction around the American assumption, but also specifically the contradiction around, say, emancipation itself being enough, or the vote itself being enough, involves these two currents kind of coming together, right? It involves understanding that political rights and economic resources are part of the equation, and as Du Bois puts it, that behind that lay this question of force, right? Physical force. I think we take some questions here before we move on to some of the pieces that come up later in the chapter. But we're still working through some of the tensions and some of the contradictions of abolition democracy, what it means, but also what it comes to mean. A question in the room. See if we may have some in the chat as well.
My question is about, like, one of the things that I remember from earlier is the discussion of, like, the abolition movement as just an extreme, like, minority position.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of back and forth about, like, he makes sort of statements about, like, throughout the course of the war, the common people became more opposed to slavery and into abolition. But I'm kind of, to me, it seems like one of the biggest problems here is that there is not a mass movement or the organizational structure for a mass movement for Reconstruction outside of the Freedmen's Bureau, or there's just maybe from, like, my like obsession with, like, the labor is, like, there's just, like, not a hierarchy of, like, how to get all this shit done. And maybe it's later in the chapter where, like, these votes are so close and the money is so you have to fight for every little $250,000, $500,000. I'm just kind of curious about, like, that like these like this, like, super minority position being really, really difficult to overcome that politically in order to, like, make Reconstruction happen. If that,
Yeah.
I know it's kind of like a rant,
No,
but
no,
like,
it's a really great
but
question.
it's
There's
like
multiple.
there's just like not enough people, and
Yeah,
they're not
yeah.
able to leverage
Mhm.
that in the North, and are struggling to do so with freedmen in the South as well.
It's a really, really good question, and it allows us, I think, to track multiple different pieces in important ways. And I'm not going to say I disagree with that, but on a certain level, there's lots of people, right? And on a certain level, the question is, how are we looking at it, right? And what are the parameters, right? The first thing is, and I've said this as something that I often emphasize when it comes to thinking about abolition today, is that very suddenly, abolitionists were no longer a tiny minority, right? They had been fringe fanatics. There are historical moments when revolutionary ideas become mass ideas, right? When they grip the masses. We see this over and over again. We see it in 2020, right? We see the shifts that are set into motion, right? And so that's the first thing to say, right? Is that, as Du Bois puts it, at a certain point during the war, 1863-ish, abolitionists no longer needed to fear the mob, right? They would no longer be attacked physically. They no longer were understood to be so beyond the pale. So they were gaining some traction, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is that we want to kind of like, um, I don't want to describe it. We want to understand that abolition is not just about the abolition of slavery, right? Literally what we're seeing out is the playing out of several steps, right? The abolition of slavery, the granting of constitutional like citizenship rights through the 14th Amendment, the right to vote in the 15th Amendment, the economic, educational, political pieces that go along with that, simultaneously. And so part of what we're going to see in this chapter is that it's not clear what abolition means unless you're talking about the specific kind of parameter. And by that I mean the abolition of slavery becomes a mainstream position. The vote then is the non-mainstream position, right? And so you're seeing this sort of hegemonic transformation over time. The third thing then is what I kind of hinted at the beginning, which is that, first of all, there is a mass movement, right? It's just a mass movement that doesn't count as a mass movement because it's Black people on the move engaging in it themselves, right? One, they're not considered to be part of the story. They're actually, as Du Bois wants to emphasize, the driving force. But it's not just racism that prevents us from seeing that, although there's that. It's also the fact that it looks different, right? When he talks about the general strike, again, this is just like recap, it's not a consciously developed or organized or well-communicated strategy that then takes place on a certain date. It needs to be understood in different ways, right? And so what he's trying to track are the ways in which there's a mass movement moving, right? People left the plantations, they moved to Union lines, they helped win the war, they transformed what the war meant, and now they're still going to play a transformative role in different ways, right? And definitely under Reconstruction, they're going to continue to play a transformative role. In this moment, it's a little more complex and kind of muted because it's being filtered through capital in a certain sense, right? Which is to say, the decisive force is still Black people. And it's a question of capital wants those votes, needs those votes, cannot accomplish what it wants without those votes, right? And so none of that is to say that you're wrong. And ultimately, the survival of Reconstruction would have required some different kind of movement, and specifically a different kind of physical force than what was ultimately the physical force that upheld it, which was a dictatorship of northern armies, right? When the northern armies are withdrawn, Reconstruction ends. Why? Because there's no other military force that can uphold it. There's no other armed force that can protect Black people, that can ensure their right to vote, and that can ensure that they can stay on lands that have been redistributed or been collectivized. Yeah. What else?
Okay, so a question from the chat that we have is, where do we see the ideas of Sumner and Stevens looking forward being expressed in the present day?
Can you repeat it? Sorry.
Where do we see the ideas of Sumner and Stevens, quote, looking forward being expressed in the present day?
I'm not super clear on what the question means, but what Sumner and Stevens represented in the moment was a dedication to abolition as a growing and expansive project, right? But one which, and this really connects in a certain way to the previous question, because it's like part of what's so dynamic and dialectical about this book is that he'll start this chapter by saying abolition democracy is this, but then it's just like throughout the chapter, it's becoming bigger, it's becoming different, it's becoming more ambitious, right? And so does Sumner get all of that? No. Does Stevens get all of that? No. Garrison doesn't. Phillips, like they don't understand the full breadth of it because it's being propelled by the movement, right? Because they're realizing, for example, that the vote is not enough. They're realizing that they need land. They're all of these things. So if I don't know what it means to bring those forward to the present, but it means something like, those people who engage, particularly on the political level, right, embracing certain pieces of what liberation would mean today, important pieces that unleash implications that are far beyond what they themselves maybe are considering or understanding it, if that makes sense. They are not the driving force, but they're key mechanisms for unleashing and supporting that, right? And he has a huge appreciation for Sumner. They're not, they're not framed as sort of reformists, right? They're not framed as halfway radicals or anything. They're people who are, Sumner is up there blocking the entire functioning of Congress, overruling the veto of Johnson multiple times. He's filibustering. He's speaking for hours and days to make sure that he's not that abolitionists are not shut down. Right. This is what they're doing. Right. And again, people that know the story of Sumner, he's almost beaten to death for it. Right. These are people that are definitely a huge part of the movement. But Du Bois is also showing the way that they're subject to this sort of broader historical cunning that they're not fully aware of. Cool. People good with questions for now? Awesome.
Considering what is going on in the country today, is the United States in a capitalist or autocracy state?
Yes. Yes. Is there more to the question or no? No, that's 100% it. Yeah. I mean, this is, Du Bois is telling the prehistory of the present, right? It's capitalist autocracy. It has been. It is, the disenfranchisement of Black people in particular and of labor that allowed that capitalist autocracy has not been rolled back, has not been transformed. It's been slowly chipped away at, sort of up until the 60s, and then resegregation, new forms of disenfranchisement that we know today in terms of the lifting of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court, essentially the sort of like remnants of what little dictatorship over the South remained in terms of federal oversight, the new turn to explicit strategies for disenfranchisement of Black people and poor people in particular, right? That's been going on for decades now. Not only is it the case that we're still under a capitalist autocracy, but it's getting worse, right? And it's getting worse for reasons and by mechanisms that Du Bois is helping us understand. So that's part of why 90 years later, this book is so crucial. So yes, we'll get back to the capitalist autocracy piece in the decline and the fall of Reconstruction. We got one more in the room, actually. If you for those who are on the stream, you can't see we've got a great crew in the room today.
There's hundreds of us.
Absolutely.
So when you're first talking about the sort of two theories, it made me think about Aziz Rana's like two faces of American democracy, or American freedom, so his sort of like contrasting of this earlier notion of like the self-autonomous settler, who is white, who is male, et cetera, and then the sort of later vision of freedom we have, which involves a state that gives rights, but is also is supposedly at least supposed to be universal in some sense. And it made me think about the timing of this rise of capitalist autocracy and like the sort of final like genocide and wars against indigenous communities, which is like the 60s, 70s, 80s, right? It's like right around this time. And I'm just curious if like there's a way in which the sort of ultimate victory of the capitalist autocracy also has something to do with the closing of the West around this time, and a sort of shift in the settler colonial project.
That's a great question. I don't think I would see it as I don't think, properly speaking, it coincides with the closing of the West, right? Talking about the arrival in the West coincides with this moment, right? But that's just the beginning of the arrival, right? That's not even capital fully penetrating, the West. And of course, one of the most important things to remember about Lincoln, aside from the fact that he wasn't always the abolitionist that we frame him as, is that he oversaw one of the most important mass executions of indigenous people, right? And that comes relatively late, right? So that even then, that's like a shocking thing, right? When we're talking about this sort of consecration of American dominance over the Midwest and then the West. Greg Grandin has a great book called, what's it called? The End of the Myth, right? About the role of the frontier in American ideology and self-understanding, right? And the idea of this expansiveness being crucial, right? We talked about the way that the expansion was a material undergirding of individual freedom, right? There's a lot of great thought about this. Enrique Dussel, who's sort of a great liberation philosopher across Latin America, who died only a few years ago. He had a really important theory of the way that the entirety of Western philosophy of individual sovereignty, the ego cogito, right, the thinking ego of Descartes, he says it's no coincidence that emerged 100 years after the conquest, right, where actually radically sovereign individuals who were beyond even the scope of the crown's power were doing whatever they wanted, right? Absolutely free, absolute individuals, absolutely sovereign, right? So the conquest is a foundation for even conceptions of Western individuality and freedom. Greg Grandin gives us, in a way, the importance of that throughout U.S. history, but also the ways in which something like Trump represents the crisis of its conclusion, right? Or the crisis of the closure. Like, he would locate the closure now, right? Which is to say, it wasn't 150 years ago. It's now where there's no way for everyday American nativists to think about expansion, right? Then again, like, he wrote this book, it was a great book, came out a couple of years ago, and now we're talking about Greenland, we're talking about Canada, we're talking about the endless need for this expansiveness, right? That, again, underpins that sort of radical individualism. It's built right into it from the beginning. So the question of closure could be understood in different parameters, right? Is the parameter the material implantation of capital? If that's the case, then, like, a lot of the West is not fully, exploited to the maximum. But on the symbolic level, these things operate differently than on the material level.
What was the last philosopher you cited there?
Enrique Dussel, Dussel. Yeah, it's a great philosopher, incredibly important. Cool. So we're talking about the way that abolition democracy matures. We're talking about the way that it develops a greater understanding. All of this is happening in a sort of a heated crucible of the Johnson years, where suddenly abolitionists are at the center of debates, and people are turning to abolitionists for answers about what Reconstruction should look like. They're beginning to understand more and more the limitations of simple freedom. You've got thinkers like, and again, he focuses on Sumner and Stevens in Congress, but you've got crucial thinkers that he's also citing, of course, Douglass. Frederick Douglass is one of the most important. Also, William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and they're all, in certain ways, part of this broad conversation. Phillips, very, very famous abolitionist, this is the very bottom of 199, says, "Our philosophy of government since the 4th of July, 1776, is that no class is safe, no freedom is real, no emancipation is effectual, which does not place in the hands of the man himself the power to protect his own rights." He's being vague with it, but it raises the question of, like, well, you've got freedoms, how do you protect freedoms? That's already a step forward, right? From the fact that freedom on paper is enough, right? And then he's talking about the votes, the need for the vote as a means of protecting that freedom, right? I'm trying to find this great passage that, that Du Bois is sort of bringing forth. Where's this? The need for a means of protecting himself, right? The need for a mechanism of that. where is this great quote? He has this great quote that says, the timber, like what other timber do we have for the building of states? Oh, it's right there. It is right there at the top. The Negro must be given the franchise because we have no other timber to build states with, right? That's a very ambivalent statement, right? He's not saying that the vote is enough. He's saying that's what we've got, right? In terms of the political question of power. We have no other timber to build states with, and unless you build with him, we must postpone Reconstruction for many years, right? So there are different elements of the abolitionist movement that are pushing in the same direction. Douglass is talking, of course, he's, as he puts it, immediate, unconditional, and universal enfranchisement of the black man. Why? Among other reasons, because he says he is at the mercy of the mob and has no means of protecting himself. Again, these are people talking about the right to vote and its importance, but they're also laying out something which is very material, right? Which is, will they be killed? Which is, how do they protect themselves? Which is, how do they protect even that right to vote? All this is very interesting because as Du Bois lays out, not all abolitionists supported the vote or supported the immediate vote. And he focuses on Garrison, who makes several different arguments. He says, for example, emancipation. He says, listen, we're abolitionists, right? Emancipation does not automatically mean the right to vote. Again, these are very different questions that emerge historically over and through a process. He's on the one hand seeing it as a process. He's saying, let's not move too quickly. He's also saying, let's keep them separate. And he's saying fundamentally, what is the precondition to the vote? Du Bois says something very interesting about Garrison. He doesn't simply reject the arguments. He doesn't simply attack him. He says, this is about a third of the way down on page 201. He says, here was sound political argument, but unsound economics. So he's not even refuting Garrison entirely. He says he's right on political questions, he's wrong on economics. What is he right about on politics? He's right about, firstly, the fact that the vote could be manipulated. He said you give people a vote, but if nothing else changes, then anyone can manipulate that vote, anyone can buy that vote, anyone can be forced or compelled to use that vote in a certain kind of way. This is interestingly something that women use to get the right to vote. Often, like through one of the arguments is made, right? Is like, why are you so concerned? We're just going to vote with our husbands, right? We're going to vote for the same party as our husbands. Don't worry about it. Not that big of a risk. Garrison is raising this as, part of what Du Bois understands as a sound political argument. The other piece, though, is this really, again, we talked about Hegel and the master-slave dialectic and the need for struggle, the need to struggle for freedom. Garrison says, only by a struggle on the part of the disenfranchised and a growing conviction of its justice, right? The vote will only matter if it's been fought for, if it's been struggled for, and if that struggle begins with those who are disenfranchised. So Du Bois is saying there's something really key in that argument, right? And again, it's at the heart of this question of what it means to fight for freedom and to win it. What is the unsound economics, though? The real place that Garrison runs, afoul of Du Bois is not what we might expect on the political piece, but it's the unsound economics of the American assumption of building wealth through thrift and work. Because part of what Garrison is arguing is that, listen, let's not fight for the vote right now. Let's work on the educational piece. Let's work on the economic piece. And then the Black community will develop a kind of wealth that can make that freedom real, right? Or that can make that vote count. He's saying that's not likely, right? Du Bois is saying on the economic level, that relies on the idea that absent other forms of power, Black people will be allowed to accumulate wealth. We know perfectly well that's not true, right? It was made very clear with the aerial bombardment of Black Wall Street, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? In which people who had acquired wealth through thrift, through labor, were destroyed by a white mob with the aid, the assistance of the federal government. But Garrison is putting, forward the parameters of why, and we raised this question at the beginning, why the vote was a compromise for abolitionists, right? Why the vote was something that the capitalists wanted, but the abolitionists hesitated. to embrace, right? And it was primarily because it wasn't enough, right? Simply having the vote without education, simply having the vote without economic equality, simply having the vote without material force was not going to be enough. And many abolitionists, albeit for very, very different and contradictory reasons, knew this to be true. And I want to bring people over to, this is on page 206, the broader importance of this question for Du Bois. Democracy, that inevitable end of all government, faces eternal paradox, right? All government leads toward democracy, according to Du Bois, but it faces eternal paradox, meaning there's a contradiction built into it, right? In all ages, the vast majority of men have been ignorant and poor, and any attempt to arm such classes with political power brings the question, can ignorance and poverty rule? If they try to rule, their success and the nature of things must be halting and spasmodic, if not ultimately nil, and it must incur the criticism and raillery of, I assume that's how that word is pronounced, of the wise and the well-to-do. On the other hand, if the poor, unlettered toilers are given no political power and are kept by exploitation in poverty, they will remain submerged unless rescued by revolution. And a philosophy will prevail, teaching that the submergence of the mass is inevitable and is on the whole best, not only for them, but for the ruling classes. What is the point here? In a certain way, what Du Bois is raising is a sort of chicken and egg question around political and economic rights, right? The progression of history, the progression of what we call democracy, is the gradual enfranchisement, incorporation into political participation of groups that were excluded, but were excluded for reasons, right? Not just randomly. It's not the case that in history, a certain percentage randomly selected is not allowed to participate. It's that they're not allowed to participate for economic or racial reasons, right? Those people are also simultaneously kept out of educational structures, right? They're not trained, they're not educated to participate in politics. When they're incorporated, this raises a question, and he's very much foregrounding questions that will be crucial for Reconstruction, which is, listen, like, when you suddenly enfranchise a bunch of poor people and give them political power, people that were excluded, people that had hardly been literate prior to abolition, not everything is going to go to plan. Not everything is going to be systematically successful. And part of what Du Bois is arguing throughout the book is that that's totally normal. But what he's arguing here is that it also raises really important questions for what he's calling democracy, but what we could understand more generally as the question of transition. And again, that's something that I think about a lot. So maybe I'm sort of loading a little more into Du Bois here, but I think it's very much present, right? Which is, how do we get from here to there? How do we prepare ourselves for assuming power, for being ready to take on that power? How do we prepare our communities for abolition, right, today? What does that look like? Which involves a lot of work, which involves an understanding that we're not already prepared for that, right? And this is the question that abolitionists are raising, and that's why they're hesitating some around whether the vote is the primary question, right? Because it's not just yes or no to the vote, it's also, how do we get land redistribution? How do we get education? How do we make sure that those pieces are present? So these are crucial pieces, right? What's happening in the meantime? The 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, except, right? And the except is around incarceration and conviction of a crime, but still, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. Again, we need to be clear on the different mechanisms. 1863, emancipation. That's not abolition. That's emancipation by decree of Lincoln. It applies in very specific ways to the way that the war is playing out. Actual abolition, meaning the systematic abolition, needs to be ratified, and it takes the form of an amendment. The amendment emerges because that's how you force Southern states formerly in rebellion to embrace emancipation as a precondition for them being reincorporated. all of the debates we're going to see are about reincorporation and the conditions of that reincorporation. All of the debates around Reconstruction are, do we want the minimal Reconstruction, which says, you know what, these southern, all the southern states have to do is basically like suggest that they were wrong, seceding and bringing war for slavery, and then we'll introduce them back in. That's sort of where Johnson ends up, right? Or does Reconstruction have to be systematic rebuilding before those states can actually be reincorporated and readmitted? That readmission will be tied to the amendments, right? States need to ratify the 13th to be readmitted. But what we begin to see in this interim, right, in this period, is that some states are ratifying the 13th Amendment and passing their own provisos that say, but no black votes, right? Because they're worried about it, they're thinking about it, even though the 13th Amendment doesn't say anything about it. So that's one thing that's happening materially. Another thing that's happening is that, as Du Bois puts it, the proletariat itself is not a unified category. This is on page 216. He says we often picture, and this is a general rule, right? We picture the proletariat, the working class, to be a unified category. In reality, it's not. It's incredibly fragmented. And he says specifically, it was divided in this case into four broad sets of people. Freedmen, so in other words, freed black people. Second, poor Southerners, poor white Southerners, I should say. And third, northern skilled laborers and northern common laborers. As he puts it, these groups never came to see their common interests. But he does also show some of the ways in which the tensions and contradictions are being navigated, and in which certain sectors of the working class are gaining more of an embrace of abolition. And then the third really key concrete thing that's happening is the Freedmen's Bureau, right? The emergence of this, what we could see as the mechanism and the machinery of the transition in the South. The Freedmen's Bureau is what emerges in this period of transition, pressing toward Reconstruction, but it's not fully Reconstruction. Nevertheless, the way Du Bois describes it is really incredible. On page 219, in the middle of 219, the Freedmen's Bureau was the most extraordinary and far-reaching institution of social uplift that America has ever attempted. It had to do not simply with emancipated slaves and poor whites, already poor whites are part of this equation, right? But also with the property of Southern planters. It was a government guardianship for the relief and guidance of white and black labor, from a feudal agrarianism to modern farming and industry. For this work, there was and had to be a full-fledged government of men. It made laws, executed them, and interpreted them. It laid and collected taxes, defined and punished crimes. In other words, this is the beginning of the dictatorship that Reconstruction would be. And he says the Freedmen's Bureau rose automatically as a result of the slaves' general strike during the war. A social revolution, or the possibility and the mechanism of a social revolution. This is the transitional machinery that emerges, is the Freedmen's Bureau. And when we say transition, again, think the question of how do we ensure that political rights are also economic rights? The Freedmen's Bureau was educating, was building schools, was making certain that freed people were then able to incorporate themselves into active political life. So it was doing that work. In other words, the work raised by the question of which comes first, the political or the economic rights. It was beginning that process. In the end, though, the most powerful argument for the vote, and again, this is something that we're going to be seeing play out over the next few chapters, the most powerful argument was really the argument that had been an argument of, on the one hand, convenience, but also of material necessity. Right? It was that Black people had been the only loyal people that has supported the Union, that had saved the Union, right? For Du Bois, there's a stronger reading that says they were the reservoir of democracy, actual democracy, right? But for many people, it's just simply like, listen, they were loyal. The South was not loyal. They demonstrated their loyalty in a context of disloyalty in the South. And gradually, this leads to an argument that essentially says, we can trust these people to vote, right? Because they have shown their loyalty already, right? Because you'll see these, picture people having arguments about who can be entrusted to vote. And what's going on simultaneously in those arguments is, are we allowing former Confederate generals to run in those elections, right? So these arguments and debates are happening at the same time. And it is an argument about disenfranchisement, right? Because there is a disenfranchisement of Confederates, right? That's part of the Reconstruction program from the very beginning. Du Bois closes his chapter with maybe the clearest expression of this view, and it comes from an 1864 convention of Black leaders. This is on 235. When he says, this is the convention is insisting that giving the vote to formerly enslaved Black Americans, if that is done, you have at once 4 million of friends who will guard with their vigilance, and if need be, defend with their arms the ark of federal liberty from the treason and pollution of her enemies. Again, the idea that Black Americans were the best defenders of democracy, that becomes the argument for the vote, for the 15th Amendment moving forward. And so at first, Abraham Lincoln looked back towards some stable place in the relation of Blacks and whites in the South on which men could begin to build a new edifice for freedom, meaning looking toward deportation, looking toward colonization. But then there's a shift, Du Bois insists. There can be no doubt that Abraham Lincoln never would have accepted the Black codes. He began by looking backward and then turned with this forward-looking word. Lincoln, looking backward, begins to look forward, and he's killed at that moment, shortly after that moment. On the other hand, and this is now foreshadowing, Andrew Johnson started looking forward toward free land, again, think settler colonialism, toward free land in the interest of the suppressed laborers in the South. And then realizing that one half this laboring class was Black, he turned his face toward reaction. He accepted the Black codes, and thus he faced the winter of 1865, the representatives of the people and the United States in the 39th Congress assembled. Right? Johnson begins by looking forward. He's a poor, white frontier worker, and then turns to face reaction. That's going to be the next chapter. That's going to be what he calls the transubstantiation of a poor white. Now, we'll take some questions in a second. I will say, though, and this is what I was sort of like raising at the beginning, first and foremost, we're doing 2 chapters for next week. Second is that the transubstantiation chapter, this is, again, Du Bois's massive hate letter to Andrew Johnson, is like 100 pages on its own. Right? There's a lot going on, a lot of historical content. It's covering the permanent standoff between Johnson and Congress. What's going to happen is that Johnson is flattered by the planters. He's a poor white who all it takes is just a little bit of flattery to begin to feel like he can become one of the people that he had hated, right? Turns against Reconstruction, and every step of Reconstruction has to go over his head. Every step he's trying to block it, every step he's vetoing, and then Congress is overruling his veto, and then he's vetoing, and the Congress is overruling his veto. It's a war between the branches of government. And there's so much to say about this chapter. So there's a lot in there to pay attention to. Think about the language of transubstantiation, right? It's a religious language. He turns to the religious meaning of it toward the end of the chapter. Think also of the fact that it's a constitutional crisis. Reconstruction is a constitutional crisis. At a certain moment, this is a generalized phenomenon. Again, Enrique Dussel, this Latin American philosopher, is a very good analyst of this. At a certain point, institutional structures need to give way, right? Those moments are moments of constitution, of constituent power, where people come together and say, this doesn't work for us anymore. They're moments of heightened democracy. where we realize that what democracy actually means is for us to be able to make and remake the existing world, right? What that means in Reconstruction is that the existing institutional structure doesn't give us the answers. All this fetishization that we have of the Constitution in this country neglects the fact that a bunch of old men, white men, who certainly smelled horrifically, and so are, I don't think that's not irrelevant, right? I mean, these are disgusting old people sitting around in a room sweating in Philadelphia, and we're supposed to think that they're laying down eternal truths that can never be changed, right? So yeah, no, the institutions need to be changed. They were designed for hundreds of years ago, and they were designed for specific purposes. And that's why Reconstruction leads to a process of amending the Constitution. That's why it leads to a process of transforming those institutions in a fundamental way. And the same questions that were confronted in the Reconstruction amendments are the questions that are being raised today, right? There's a systematic attempt to roll back the advances of Reconstruction today, and it rests on the same kind of constitutional crisis that occurred 150 years ago. So next week, we'll deal with 2 chapters, the transubstantiation and the price of disaster. So we need to move quickly through those and on toward Reconstruction itself. Let's take some questions, though. I know I went a little longer than normal.
Thank you. I don't know. This is maybe either like very naive or too broad, but I haven't read Hegel, and I'm interested. I feel like the way that you and Du Bois and Hegel are like thinking about everything in this like kind of dialectical push and pull of history like leaves open for me this question of like the extent / like existence of individual or group agency, and like I don't know, like things are happening when the conditions are right, and the abolitionists are no longer considered the minority when they're, or no longer considered fanatics when their views align with the capitalists, and the contradictions become untenable and all of this stuff. And he's obviously positioning Black Americans as like central driving forces, but even them, like it's unclear to me the extent to which he sees them as like cannily harnessing the forces like as actors living among them, like in like their own era.
That's a great question. It's a really, really great question, right? About where's agency actually in this story, right? On the one hand, we're talking about, for example, enslaved people playing a key role, being the source of historical transformation, but does that all get kind of like, in a very Hegelian way, like folded into the broader movement of history, right? There's a lot to be said here, I think, and it's not, none of this is really deep or super confusing, right? Like these are, the way that certain thinkers have used certain ideas is usually to express very basic ideas, right? Namely the fact that there are things that are happening beyond our control. There are economic forces, there are political forces. Individuals act in history in a way that is not, the famous Marxian phrase, right, is that like men make history, but not under conditions of their own choosing, right? Individuals intervene, they can play major roles in historical transformations, but when you diagnose how they operate and what opportunities to make change, those opportunities are created by that historical structure as well, right? So in a certain way, things, feel like you're struggling to identify where agency and structure in the sort of classic kind of formulation intervene. What I think is important to understand is that, first of all, right, just basic shit, right? Many Black and anti-colonial revolutionaries turn to Hegelian dialectics because it's about struggle, right? Because it says, listen, when we struggle, we're building our own freedom. And that struggle is important internally also for us to develop our own self-consciousness. That's the piece, right? That's why Fanon, that's why Aimé Césaire, that's why so many others are reading Hegel. And they're also finding limitations of Hegel, because Hegel will say things like, well, like when individuals act in this case, along very much hand in hand with your question, they're actually just doing the unconscious work of history, right? For Hegel, that historical progression and development is kind of predetermined and automatic, and people are just kind of like pawns in this broader scheme. That's maybe oversimplifying, but that's definitely the way that Hegel understands this idea of the cunning of history, which is that you could do all of these things and maybe you contribute, but you contribute in a way that history is already kind of written into it, right? And that there's a singular direction, right? Again, anti-colonial Black revolutionary thinkers tend to give up on that part, right? And again, the why is very clear, right? Which is that history doesn't progress toward greater self-consciousness, right? People are living in collective organic communities, and then colonizers arrive and destroy those communities. And we will not fall into the argument that Marx falls into at a certain point that says the destruction of those communities was all for the greater good of this historical progression toward modern communism, right? That teleology is what it's often referred to. It's about this idea that we move in one direction toward a goal or an end, is not something that that someone like Du Bois or Césaire or Fanon or others would uphold, right? So they're giving up on certain pieces of this, and in that they're kind of definitely loosening up this space for different kinds of agency, right? So again, what does that look like? It looks like Du Bois recentering enslaved people. There's two mistakes there, right? For like maybe a traditional understanding. One is that like you're reducing the agency of that community, but secondly, you're blind to that community's existence as a crucial economic force, right? Or as a class, or as part of the working class. So he's recentering Black people, but he is also saying that to do that means understanding agency looks a little different, right? He doesn't say that in any kind of magical way. He says, listen, they weren't in communication, right? But they all did the same thing at the same time, right? Which is to say, walk off the plantation. It's more spontaneous, it's less organized. That's a material response to their conditions of labor and existence, and it makes perfect sense to Du Bois, but it also means that we have to understand agency slightly differently. Again, the way that agency coalesces in the abolitionist movement is also subject to this sort of push and pull of history. Abolitionists are arguing for abolition, 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 and then suddenly, after John Brown leads the attack on Harper's Ferry, it's a whole different scenario, right? Suddenly, after 1861, right, and the states start to secede, it's a totally different scenario, right? History does move in ways that then allows these individual arguments to gain relevance in a way that they didn't, right? So you could say, does it decrease agency? Sure, because Sumner had been arguing for abolition and no one was listening, right? Or John Brown had been arguing for abolition and no one was listening for a long time, right? But that's how history moves, I think, is part of it, right? Yeah. That's a good question. What else?
We have a question from the chat that says, I'm thinking about our world today, and I want to ask how abolitionists go from a fringe group to a mainstream position. Let's go back to Du Bois's point about the general strike.
Sorry, was the middle part? I couldn't really hear.
I want to ask about how the abolitionists go from a fringe group to a mainstream position. Does it go back to his point about the general strike? I think his meaning Du Bois.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, and these questions are all related. I really love it. Like abolition becoming mainstream. Again, I love this question. I love this theme because it's so relevant for us today, right? And I'm just going to keep saying it, so I'll say it again, which is that like we act as if prisons and police are eternal institutions when they're very new, right? The main thing historical materialists do in the Marxist tradition is to historicize, saying these things emerge historically. That means that they don't need to exist forever, right? In this context, we're talking about, today police and prisons. In the past, slavery. It seems unimaginable for us to live without police or prisons, but guess what? It was unimaginable for many people to imagine a world without slavery, right? Because it was framed as an institution that could only, that was the only way that labor could be organized in the U.S. South in particular, right? So that's always a call to say, when we historicize, we're talking about our power to transform and overthrow institutions and replace them with others. And the moment of the mainstream of abolition in this context, 1859 to 1865, 1863, is precisely important for us because it allows us to understand that you can be a small number of people making kind of arguments in a context in which those arguments are becoming very real, and you can have a huge impact, right? that should never, we should never think that it's impossible for us to press these arguments forward, to see a dramatic and sudden transformation. Again, that's all we see, again. And the source is the same, right? When does meaning shift in our recent history? Meaning shifts in Ferguson. Meaning shifts in the Baltimore rebellions. Meaning shifts in and around Minneapolis in 2020. People were hashtagging Black Lives Matter on Twitter, and it didn't matter until Ferguson, right? It's the mass struggle, again, in this case, in some ways spontaneous struggle, in some ways unorganized struggle, unorganized to the point of us being told that it's irrational and it has no, that it doesn't lead anywhere, right? It's irrational, it doesn't produce lasting change. But the reality is the only thing that produces change, right? And the question of how to make it lasting is the question of organization in the aftermath, right? So, abolition mainstreams in this period and expands and gains traction because of this storm of different factors, which are economic, which are political, which involve, for Du Bois, material realities of the US South, which involve, as we've seen, the consciousness of the planter, which involves the whip of the counter-revolution, which says that the planters themselves, being so blind and stubborn to reality, pushes them toward war. And then the fact that, and the fundamental fact, and the question here is exactly right, that it is the general strike of Black labor that sets all of this down the path of abolition, right? That general strike, as he puts it, is anchored in the fugitive slave, right? Individuals fleeing becomes hundreds of thousands of individuals fleeing. And then as he puts it in this chapter, so I love this kind of full circle piece, the Freedmen's Bureau is the conclusion in many senses of the general strike, right? It's this trajectory from what it means to flee from slavery and then to begin to build an alternative, right? To create a machinery capable of building that alternative. So yes, it's the general strike. In other words, it is what we often call self-activity, the Black self-activity that sets all this into motion, that is the source of the transformation of the meaning of abolition and its mainstream kind of purchase. Sorry, that answer got a little rowdy, but brought it back.
I just wanted to maybe give like another, I think like the question of agency that you brought up is like really, I don't know, important. And it made me think about a book I read when I was in college called They Left Great Marks on Me by Kidada E. Williams, which is, I mean, it's a terrible book, but it's basically all about, she's gathering all of this correspondence by Black people about the violence that they face, letters sent to Congress, like epistolary letters to each other, all these kinds of like moments of self-organization in the face of terrorism, essentially. And I think the book covers kind of like Civil War all the way through World War I. So it kind of has like a very broad view of history. So I'm sure like if we could find like the chapters on Reconstruction, you'd find some stuff there. But I feel like that's, even though it's like a pretty like violent and terrible example, there's a lot of pretty powerful documentation of like refusal and attempts at self-organizing, attempts at trying to, what's the right word? One of the unfortunate things about this book, the reality that it documents, is the fact that these Black communities are asking for federal reinforcements. And the cavalry almost never comes. Almost never. And it's pretty shocking to read about that. So that's just another example I would share about that.
No, I appreciate that.
Someone from the chat asks, can you clarify the contradiction built into democracy one more time?
Of what?
Can you clarify the contradiction built into democracy one more time?
Oh, built into the contradiction, built into democracy. The paradox that he mentions is really the question of the expansion of democracy, right? And again, this is a material question. It's the question of the fact that democracy emerges, as we know. We talk a lot about the origins of democracy, and it originates in slave states in ancient societies that had democracy limited to a very small number. The question of democracy historically over time, and this is in political theory, it's called the boundary problem, right? What are the boundaries of the demos, meaning the people that count for democracy? I say that because we often are taught that democracy means everyone, right? Democracy has never meant everyone. Today, it doesn't mean everyone, right? It doesn't mean children. It doesn't mean, like migrants under many circumstances. There are always boundaries built into it that people justify or oppose, right? Historically, though, we've seen the expansion of, well, not always, but we've seen in general an expansion of this question. But what Du Bois is raising is the fact that what it means is, and this is something also raised by someone like the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, of who would be a good legislator. And it's the person who's already good and already educated and already able to lead could then be the good legislator. But how do you get that person if, where, again, chicken and the egg? Where does the good person, the good leader, the good political participant, the good voter come from, if not from voting, participating, and other forms of education? And specifically, the way that Du Bois is making it very material is to say that this historical incorporation is incorporation of poor people, right? And the question, these are very recent questions. What he's talking about around abolition and slavery is simultaneously occurring across the globe and in Western European democracies around the so-called social question. What does that mean? It means, what do we do with all of these poor people that capitalism is producing? What do we do with all of this, these sort of uneducated urban poor who don't have social services, who are not going to school? Are they supposed to be part of democracy? They hadn't been up to that point, but they're beginning to struggle and fight gradually over time for that incorporation. And so the paradox that Du Bois is raising is this question of, it's not simply the question of, are people prepared to participate in democracy, which is not even for him the fundamental piece of it. It's also what happens when they do and don't do a great job, or the rich can find faults in what they're doing, and doesn't this undermine democracy and weaken it from the very beginning, right? That's where it becomes for him an actually important question, right? It's not about continuing to exclude people, it's about thinking about what kind of incorporation is necessary for people to participate, which in this case means, does education need to come before the vote? Or is the vote the best form of education? Those are questions about quality of democratic participation. Underlining and underpinning all of those is the bigger question of just the material force that will make democracy possible, right? Because in this case, you're talking about the forcible inclusion of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that another category of hundreds of thousands and millions of people don't want included, right? So there are many tensions and many contradictions that he's trying to say, express in this general, question, but then in the specificity of the U.S. South, it gains an additional kind of force. What else?
Question from the chat. How could these lessons help us avoid the pitfalls of co-optation by capital and neoliberal forces?
How do we avoid the pitfalls of co-optation by capital? Shit, that's a good question. I wish I knew. Again, we live in a capitalist autocracy. The main parameters that Du Bois is laying out are parameters that apply to us today, right? He says this thing about the American assumption, which I almost forgot. In other words, about Bootstrap's theory, which I can't believe I almost forgot because it's kind of amazing. He's talking about Bootstrap's theory being sort of true up until 1860 because of the availability of land. And then he says, oh yeah, 2/3 of the way down 183. The validity of the American assumption ceased with the Civil War, meaning it ceased to be true. But its tradition lasted down to the day of the Great Depression, when it died with a great wail of despair. He's saying that the American assumption died with the Great Depression. And of course, he's writing in the midst of that Great Depression. And so we don't want to take it too literally, but he's trying to say that, that the Great Depression doomed this idea, right? And he's saying it's not just the collapse. He's saying the collapse was caused by Wall Street investors, by, what had been the dramatic expansion of economic inequalities, right? The autocracy of capital, again, playing out to its final contradictions, bringing the system down with it. If we read him as being optimistic, he's saying, listen, like no one believes in that shit anymore. But sadly, we know that's not true. We know that the American assumption has deep, deep roots in this country. We know that people still believe it, that even when they don't believe it, they act as if they believe it, and that it's used to uphold the status quo all the time, right? On a very, very basic level, what does it mean? What is the political consequence of the American assumption is that we are not a class of workers. We are not a movement of people fighting for equality. We're individuals whose best strategy for advancement is on an individual level, right? The relationship is between us and wealth. All we have to do is work hard and we can move up. This is something that is drilled into us all the time from childhood on, right? It's incredibly powerful. It's incredibly tempting for people who, even people that know that it's not true, even people whose everyday lived reality disproves it, right? And Trump is the expression of this. Not him, but the fact that people vote for him, right? The fact that people convince themselves that a billionaire cares about them, represents their best interests, that he was a self-made man somehow when he wasn't. He actually inherited money from his white supremacist, landlord father, right? That Elon Musk claims to be self-made when he inherited fucking diamond mine money from South Africa. Like, none of this is true, right? No one is self-made, right? And it's not to say no one, but like the entirety of the system militates against people actually overcoming their class background, right? This is something that is very hard to convince Americans of. And I know I'm getting a little off topic, but what Du Bois is offering us is understanding the American assumption is at the very heart of that co-optation process, right? That's how capital co-opts us. And in the hyper neoliberalization of today, right, it reaches absurd levels where we are self-branding, we are, content creators, we are building our own personal individual brand that even if we're not getting paid for it now, we might get paid for it in the future. You know what I mean? Like, that's the way the American assumption plays out today. As Du Bois puts it weakens unions, it weakens labor movements, it, assumes its own racialized parameters too, right, where it contributes to this division of the working class by racial and national boundaries. And it's the fundamental, piece that needs to be fought if we're going to be able to build a sort of coherent movement moving forward. Maybe we have time for maybe one more, although I know people are getting sleepy.
Question from the chat. On 190, he talks about the importance of schools for both freedmen and poor whites. To what extent, if at all, did those schools reduce anti-Blackness among poor whites who attended?
Yes, that's a great question. And again, it's a historical question. I think folks can dig into it on their own. But he's talking about the crucial role of interracial education, right? He talks about the role, as he puts it, of the northern school marm coming south and, providing an education in racial equality that is incredibly important, right? And there's not much more to say aside from the fact that, yes, it had a huge impact. Yes, the incorporation of poor whites into education, even on their own, but also in these multiracial spaces was incredibly important. But it's also, it's crucial to understand in the context of Du Bois himself, right? This is someone who, again, is shifting toward a more materialist analysis. He's become a Marxist by this point. He's become someone who looks at the world through categories of class and class struggle, and understands that that class struggle is divided and inflected by race. But this is a transition over a series of decades away from a Du Bois who centers the leadership of an elite sector of Black Americans, that sector is educated, that education is the fundamental path toward uplift, right? Du Bois has rejected that by and large, the idea that education alone liberates. But the role education plays in this text is noticeable. And there's this very strange, I always point this out, there's this very strange inclusion of an entire chapter at the end on the foundation of the public school, right? That shows that education is still incredibly important for him. Again, not education for education's sake, but education for the building of, an emancipated people and a people that will remain emancipated, right? He often refers to the foundations of Reconstruction as land, light, and leading, right? Land is economic redistribution, light is enlightenment and education, and leading as political power. But in this variant, right, in this mature Du Bois, all three of those have to be present. Education is not enough. Land itself without education is not enough. This is going to be the foundation of a incredibly, cantankerous debate between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, who thinks that just doing economic uplift is enough. No, political rights, education, and land are all essential. So for Du Bois, the role of education is crucial because of these kinds of qualitative transformations that it helps to bring about, right? Among Black people, but also among poor white people, fundamentally. The millions of poor white people who gained access to political rights and education from the Freedmen's Bureau and later from Reconstruction. That is not a guarantee. It obviously wasn't enough of a vaccination against white supremacy to prevent what ultimately happened. But for him, it was a key part of that equation. Cool. Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks to those who are sort of, joining us remotely for this conversation. We can't wait to have you back next week. Thanks. Mm-hmm.